So Luke, come to the stage, please.
Hi, I got to work on my logo. That's what I just learned. Should be like half letter, black, right? That's what I'm seeing. Okay, so today I'm here to talk about the mobile opportunity you guys have heard of and what we're kind of doing to deliver the right kind of experiences. And when I talk about mobile, I often describe it as a planet scale opportunity. And what planet am I talking about? Planet Earth, of course. Why is mobile a planet scale opportunity? Well, to start, on this planet, which is the only place we know of life that has life, unless you count Mars where there's robots, there's about 7.7 billion people. We can't necessarily create software, websites, or web apps for all of those 7.7 billion people, right? There's some people who are too old, some people who are too young, lots of other reasons. So we need to slice it a little bit. And if we look at people who are 14 and above, there's about 5.6 billion people. We can call that one definition of an addressable market. 5.6 billion in this market and 5 billion mobile subscribers. That is people that have a mobile plan, whether it's data or voice. And 4 billion active smartphones. 75% of these are Android, 25% of these are iOS. But when you compare the number of active smartphones to the number of human beings on this planet, you can see why this is a planet scale opportunity. Right? Building things for mobile means building things for the planet. And while these 4 billion smartphones vary in capabilities, some have more power, some have bigger screens and the like, they're all pretty much as powerful as what we would call supercomputers 20 or 30 years ago, right? And these things are not only supercomputers, they're portable. We can bring them with us anywhere. They're always connected to the network. All right, so that's quite an achievement and opportunity. 4 billion pocket-sized supercomputers on this planet of 7.7 billion people. And when these superpowers explore the vast network of information we've built up over the past 30 years, what kind of experience are they getting? Well, when they hit a web page, it's highly likely that they'll encounter something like this. Newsletter takeover. Or perhaps a confounding cookie policy dialog page. Maybe an app download interstitial. And it's highly probable that they won't just get one such app download interstitial, they may even get 3. How about 2 app downloads, a cookie policy, and a sign-up dialogue? Or let's throw in a fixed position ad on top of that. And you say, Luke, that's just publishers. They're really struggling. Okay, well, let's look at e-commerce then. See what's happening there. Well, it's just a US thing because they're all greedy companies. Okay, well, let's look beyond the US. Oh, it's just small companies, not big ones. Okay, let's look at some big companies. Now, based on the laughter, I assume people don't like these kinds of things, right? But they're everywhere, so they're probably designed like this because they work. This is what drives conversion. Everybody's doing this for a good reason, not just to torture all of us, right? Well, let's look at some of these things. So let's look at app download, these install ads, right? You see these everywhere. There's a whole bunch of them. It's app install banners. They come in many shapes and sizes, but they all kind of have the same point, which is to get somebody to download a native mobile app. And you may ask, well, how effective are these things? And as usual, it really depends on what we mean by effective. So it turns out if you put a full page interstitial with a giant button that says get the app, or you change the copy through some A/B test that says you really want the app, don't you? No, I'm a loser. Which I've seen happen many times. Right, it turns out some percent of people will hit that button. And in this case, when we put up this big app interstitial, 9% of the people hit that button. Success. That's an awesome conversion rate, right? 9% people click the install app button. But then when we ran a test and we removed this full page interstitial, what we saw was app downloads only dropped a little less than 2%, But the number of one-day active users on the mobile web went up 17%. What's the last A/B test you did where you got a 17% increase in daily active users? Probably can't even name one that had that kind of impact, right? So if you're measuring active users instead of conversion on the click on a button, all of a sudden the definition of what's good changes pretty quickly, doesn't it? And that 9% conversion on the big button doesn't look as good when you consider what the impact is on daily actives. Now, when we observe people using our sites, we also find that there's some challenges with these app install banners. So here's someone who has actually found something they would like to purchase, right? They have selected the color, and what they want to do is buy this. So, okay, they'll take the 3-day, okay. So, okay. So I'm kind of looking for something that looks like a shopping cart or add to cart button or something, or buy. Maybe it says buy. All right. Maybe it's hidden over here. Maybe they put it over here. I don't see anything over here. Okay, that's the end there, so that's not it. What if it's over here? No, it's not over here. Okay, maybe it's, Usually it's like here. There's usually some kind of button that says, put it in the cart or buy it, right? I think they want me to buy it, and I want to buy it, but okay, I was already here. So, I don't know. I'm trying to buy this. I really want this. I'm still trying to buy it. Okay, maybe I'll hit this weird triangle thing in the water. Okay, that is a shopping basket, but that has nothing in my basket. So does it say like add? No. How do I? Okay, well, let me go. I guess I'll go back. And, Well, have you tried pushing the little X on the app banner down at the bottom? Oh, what? That? Maybe I want this automate. I kind of want to look at it a little bit more. Let me zoom in. Crap. Oh, okay. In Bainmard's studies, they found, in the tests that they looked at, that more than half of e-commerce sites had these app install banners. And when they actually sat down and observed people trying to buy things that they wanted, these things were the direct cause of several abandonments, right? As you saw. And there's a couple other examples in the article. It's linked here. You can go take a look. And if you ask most e-commerce companies, what are the metrics you care about? I would bet selling things is probably high on the list, right? So having a user experience that negatively affects buying stuff should be a pretty big deal, shouldn't it? And when you end up with so many of these different examples, for the interest of time, I cut out several of them, but when there's so many of these examples out there of the user experience, of the design, preventing people from doing the most important thing that business tries to do, sell stuff, you may start to wonder, well, why? Is this a user experience design problem? I bet these companies don't invest at all in user experience design, right? Well, I thought that, and then I went and did just a quick search for, are they hiring? Do they have UX teams? And it turns out all of them actually have user experience design teams. And in fact, most of them tout the importance of user-centered design, right? Sephora, client-centered experience to approaching innovative products and making usable digital experiences where you can't buy. So all these companies practice user experience design. That's not the issue. But are these experiences user-centric? Would we consider this user-centered design, all the examples I just showed you? I would actually call them user-hostile in many ways, right? It's almost the opposite. And it's not just these companies. I don't mean to pick on any particular companies. You don't really have to go very far on your super-powered computer in your pocket on the internet to encounter stuff like this, right? And so they're everywhere. And when I talk to people about this, what I often hear is, oh, this is because business goals are outweighing these user experience design goals. Right? PM made me do it. Marketing made me do it. That's why I had to do it. It made me do it. But if you really care about business goals, as you saw earlier, right? Important things like with the app install banner, we were affecting daily active users. With e-commerce, we were affecting sales conversion. These things are taking a hit, and nobody's minding the farm. Nobody's watching out for that. So to understand what's really going on here, we have to go back in time a little bit to the Rhode Island School of Design. If you've ever taken a design class like the ones offered at RISD, you've experienced what's known as a design critique. This is basically in class, you go over people's work, you talk about what they did well, you discuss feedback and the like. And the thing most design critiques have in common is that they're very long and they take place in design studios. Right? So it sort of looks like this. Most of the students are sitting on the floor on comfortable stools and they sit there for hours. And at RISD, one student noticed this, the fact that everybody's sitting in these uncomfortable positions for hours, and he realized many of his classmates' butts were really after these critiques. Right? This is him. He's over there hiding. It's Joe Gabaya. And when he was 26 years old, he experienced this pain firsthand. His butt hurt after hours of design critiques. And so he went off to find a solution. And he designed this cushion, which he named Crit Buns, very literal. And then he, pushed pretty hard to sell these things. First, a bunch of people rejected it, but then he sold a bunch of units to the MoMA in New York. And then now he's got international sales across the world and the like. And the way this works is, basically makes your butt more comfortable during these long critiques. Right? And so Joe was able to build a very user-centered product here, and he addressed real pain points, right? People's butts hurt, because he was the one experiencing the pain himself. He felt it, right? After hours, he literally knew the pain that everybody else was going through in that room. And so he was able, through this intimate knowledge of the problem, to build a solution that solved that problem. Later, when Joe was in San Francisco, after graduating from RISD, he was encouraged by the success of Crit Buns. He convinced one of his friends from RISD, his former roommate, to come and move to San Francisco with him. This is Brian Chesky. And they wanted to go and start another company. But it turns out rent in San Francisco is pretty high. The two needed some money. And so Joe sent Brian an idea of how they can make a couple extra bucks. And the idea was like, hey, what if we turn our apartment into a bed and breakfast? We'll let people sleep here, we'll feed them breakfast, we'll make a couple extra bucks because there's a design conference in town. They didn't have extra beds, but they had some air mattresses, so they launched this site titled Air Bed and Breakfast. And you can see Crit Buns sponsored there, right? You got a co-market, right? So they found 3 guests that wanted to stay with them, they hosted them, they made them breakfast, and they earned $80 per guest from launching the site. And after that first weekend, they started getting emails from people around the world asking if there's similar things available for destinations like London and Japan. And the service we now know as Airbnb was born, which does 2 million guests a night. Right? They have 6 million listings worldwide, so on and so forth. And it turned out, basically, that Joe and Brian weren't the only ones with that problem. There's a bunch of other people who wanted some extra money from properties or space they had within their properties as well. But again, Joe and Brian had this intimate knowledge. They needed the money, right? They actually hosted the people. They made them breakfast. They went through this very, very direct experience. And when the user is the maker, there's not this gap between who makes the product and who is using it. It's the same person. So user-centered design is incredibly easy when you're the user, right? You both feel the same pain, you share the same perspective and the same context. But as a company grows, things change. And gaps start to open up. When Joe and Brian recruited their former roommate Nathan, who also went to school with them at RISD, to build the next version of the website, Nathan hadn't hosted people in his house. He hadn't made them breakfast. He hadn't needed the money and collected the money, right? So he lacked this intimate experience. And Joe and Brian probably had to explain to him, okay, here's how we need to do it. This is why the way it needs to be. But then we don't just have development teams. We also hire designers to make UI, brand, and style our sites. When the company grows, we then hire product managers, right, who coordinate the work of those developers and those designers, who ensure there's appropriate consideration of business impact, timelines, markets, and more. And then we may also expand functions to things like privacy, security, legal. Maybe we have a growth team. All kinds of distinct organizations start to pop up. And it increasingly becomes leadership's role to organize and manage this growing pile of people, right? They're keeping these organizations in place and oftentimes rearranging these organizations, or they're focused on topics like portfolio management or infrastructure development. And they're not the ones that are closest to the customer, but they are the ones making the decisions. And so what starts to happen is this gap emerges. We can call it the customer-company gap, or the distance between an organization and the end user. The people making the decisions have all these layers between them and the customer, which makes awareness of what's actually happening and insights very difficult to come by. If you've ever played telephone, where you send the message, imagine how it works in an organization of 100,000 people, where the people down the telephone line are actually incented to change the message to meet their agenda. I know that sounds cruel, but it's true, right? Like, oh, if I say this, I'll get another resource, and then I'll grow my team by 1. It happens. It's very real, right? And you may say, okay, so there's this gap between things. What does that actually mean for product experience? Well, these competing agendas and perspectives start creeping into the products we make, right? This customer-company gap starts to show up in product design. So here's a very simple contact form. Let's say we want people to be able to contact us on their website. Give it to a designer. Designer says, oh, okay, well, if somebody needs to contact us, I would like to know who is contacting us. Maybe we want to get back to them. Whatever is convenient for them, email, phone number, I don't care. And then they want to say something. And then there needs to be an affordance by which they can send that message to us, right? Done. Sales team hears about the fact that we're collecting leads, right? And they're like, whoa, okay, hold on. We got to get a phone number, an address, so we can send them collateral. They need to pick a subject so we can route them to the appropriate team in the sales organization. Right? Engineering's like, whoa, hold on, we can't build this. Because, in our database, we store first name and last name separately. It's called a name value pair. It's like different fields, so you have to sort of put that in the UI like that. And, streets, if the number is different, then we store that in an Oracle, SAP, something crappy, crumbling infrastructure thing. So you kind of have to do it that way, okay? Marketing. Here's we're talking to customers who are like, woohoo, we can collect demographics. Let's make sure we ask them if they're male or female, when they were born, and of course we need to opt them into our drip campaigns for the next eternity, right? Someone from the legal team hears about this form, they're like, holy cow, you're collecting all this information? Dear God. We need to throw a privacy policy and a terms of use, and has this been reviewed by counsel? What's going on? And all of a sudden, you can smell the org chart on our product designs. Right? And this isn't a new phenomenon. In fact, it was quite well articulated back in 1967 by Melvin Conway. This is Conway's law. Organizations which make systems are constrained to make designs which are copies of those internal systems. Or put more simply, everybody ships their org chart. Right? Everybody. And so as organizations grow, decision-making moves further from the customer, from those end users, from that intimate understanding of the problem, from having the problem yourself on a daily basis, from feeling your butt hurt from sitting on the wood floor. Nothing personal against any CEOs, but they're not feeling their butt hurt when they're sitting on the critique floor, right? And so our org charts start to become evident in these user-centered experiences. And while this isn't a problem in of itself, what it actually starts to do is create additional problems. Which brings us to gap number 2. And you're all on one of these, but what is this? And what do you do on it? You sit on it, right? With a chair, what it is and why it's there is a very small leap. You look at it, you kind of figure out instantly what it's there. You see it, you know what it's for. There's no gap between its form and its function. The design of the product immediately fills that gap, right? And so the purpose of the product aligns very tightly with its final form. It's designed to be sat in. The intention is very clear. Or to put it another way, the purpose and value of that product is very clear in the design. Now, let's look at another product, mostly because it's pretty fashionable these days, scooter sharing. You've all probably at least seen a scooter somewhere, right? And let's say you come upon a scooter in your town and you want to ride it. What's that experience like? Well, it starts pretty typically. It starts with, let's say, a splash screen. We've all seen these. Then, of course, there's a tutorial. Then, of course, there's a sign-up screen. Following the sign-up screen, there's a permissions dialog, some service terms and conditions kind of thing. Then back to permissions, followed by a sequence of loading an account with funds. And you got to load it up so that you can actually go ride. Then we're back to another tutorial. Once you get through that tutorial, there's going to be another permissions dialog. And then, ta-da, you're riding a scooter. Congratulations. Now, there's reasons for each of these things to exist here, right? But are all these reasons really user-centric? And when you add them all up as a full product experience, I don't think it's very hard to see why somebody might call this a painful process. Right? This doesn't feel very user-friendly, does it? So let's look at some of these reasons and figure out what's going on with the second gap. I'm going to switch scooter sharing services for a second just because there's so many of them. But here's Hello Bikes. Same thing, splash screen, sign-up screen. And then terms and conditions, 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 do you agree? Most human beings would say 15 screens of legal copy is not necessarily the best product design experience, right? Even if we make the case that, oh, well, people would really benefit from disclosure, nobody can understand this stuff. Nobody's going to read it. Nobody's going to study. Even if you're trying to do the right thing for the end user, this isn't doing it, right? And when I go and talk to teams about why do they have these kinds of things, here's what I hear. Legal made me do it. I know it's bad, but we had to do it. And so while this seems maybe like a valid reason, it starts to create this second gap, which is this gap between what something is and why it exists. So instead of the form of the product reflecting its purpose, it starts to reflect something else. In this case, it starts to reflect the requirements that came from the legal team. And they have these different perspectives of the world, so on and so forth. So the product experience isn't what's directly benefiting the consumer, but instead it's what some department told us to do. In other words, we start doing things for reasons other than the customer. Let's look at another one of these reasons. We'll do another scooter company, this time OFO. Right? Again, splash screen, right? Permission screens. And then they have a tutorial. We've seen a few of these already. And when I go and ask people about, well, why did you add this tutorial here? We're like, oh, well, everybody's got one. Right? Everybody's doing it, so we also have it. And what does that mean? Well, if you've ever worked on a software design project, you've probably experienced this process known as a competitive analysis. Right? You probably have this in your offices, like, let's go print out what everybody else has done, put it on a wall, and then think about it. what kind of outcomes do you think that's going to lead to? It's going to lead to you copying what everybody else is doing, right? Oh, it looks like they have a button. No, we should have the button too. Well, look at this. So here's all of the sign-up flows for scooter companies. And look, they all have an intro tour. So have to have an intro tour, right? And so when you look at it like this, it starts to become a good idea. And even if you never explicitly say this, just the fact that you're looking at all these things, it starts to become ingrained in your brain that that's what this is supposed to be like. Must be good. And the other thing I hear is, oh, well, I'm sure that company tested it because they've got a big company, so they probably know. Probably know it's good, so we're fine copying it. Well, when you actually do test some of these things, let's see what happens. So this is Vevo. This is a music video service, right? And of course, they have an intro tour. But when they looked at how people were making their way into the product through both direct observation and some analytics, they found that most people were just swiping through this thing and didn't read any of it. So they said, well, if everybody's just getting this out of their way, maybe things would be better if we removed it. And they did, and they ran an experiment with 160,000 people over a month. And what they found was more people successfully logged in. More people signed up. And the people who made their way through were just as active as the people who had the tour, which means the tour did nothing except keep some people from making it into the product. So you can see similar principles at work in the evolution of a couple Google products. So this is Google Photos. Google Photos used to have this onboarding flow here on Android with the typical splash screen, start screen, a few other things. And over a series of tests, all this stuff went away. And this introductory screen here, this auto backup screen, which I'll zoom in a second, was the only thing that was left, and it was redesigned a little bit. And it was redesigned to reflect the one core action you need to do to get value out of Google Photos. So what Google Photos does is it stores all of your photos for free, and then it runs a whole bunch of analysis so that you can find people based on faces, on locations, on objects. It makes suggestions for how to make your pictures better, makes little animations for you. None of those things work if you don't turn on auto backup. So what does the onboarding flow look like? Turn on auto backup, right? And it even shows you some of your pictures that you're going to be auto backupping. And this principle of getting people to the core value of your product as soon as possible, should there be some onboarding? Yes, but it should be designed to do this. Not to just throw a bunch of tutorial screens in front of people. And of course, it's challenging to know what your core value proposition is in some cases. But if you know, then it's really easy to set up an experience that gets people there quickly. So once again, we saw, though, before it was, legal made me do it, PM made me do it. With these competitive analysis things and our time being spent looking at what everybody else is doing, we start again to do things for reasons other than the customer. Rather than do the type of work Google Photos did or Vevo did to understand what people are actually doing in the product, what leads them to be successful, what we do instead is look at what everybody else is doing and do things for that reason. And again, we start to expand this gap. But wait, there's more. So another scooter sharing service. In this one, you do your phone verification and sign up, and then you get this little subscription promo. Which, when you look at the subscription promo screen, what choices do you really have there? Like I guess you hit try it free, and then you end up in this sign up. But it turns out if you hit this little arrow up here, you see that little arrow? If you hit that little arrow there, then you actually can find a scooter and unlock it. Would you have guessed that? Nobody would have guessed that. Right? And so what I strongly suspect, I don't have any insider info here, but I strongly suspect this A/B test performed really well. All right? Lots more people clicked on try it free in the design where we made the cancel like a little tiny hidden arrow in the corner. Right? So in this case, the data clearly shows this is a better design. So the data made me do it this time, right? And you've probably heard a lot of people talking about the importance of A/B testing and the impact that can have on conversion. But again, so we really need to know about what we're measuring. So the classic A/B test is, I tested a blue button versus an orange button, and the orange button got 9% more clicks, right? Ship the orange button to the moon. We dine on fine meats tonight. So these tests come back saying one item outperformed the other. Of course, it's natural to want to implement that metric, right? But now we're starting to make decisions because the data told us to do it. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? Aren't we measuring how we can improve user experiences, right? And isn't this measuring what people actually do? Yeah, but as you saw with the OFO example, context really matters here, right? You can't just blindly move in the direction that an A/B test tells us. And many of these A/B tests are driven by only like a specific business consideration as opposed to the whole experience. Many companies have results that look like that A/B button test, right? And if I added up all of your cumulative A/B testing results, like I said, you'd be dining on fine meats every night. But actual business results end up looking like this. So what's going on? Right? In isolation, we should see all these little short-term gains. But when we look long-term, we don't see that big impact that we would expect to see on overall business results. And so one of the most common reasons behind this is that we're actually not doing tests with a lot of contrast. For example, we can go and test the color of a button, or we can do a test where we completely change how somebody buys something. So going from like a whole traditional checkout flow to, let's say, dropping in one of these native payment options. And why is that different? It's different because if you change the button color, you're not really changing the fact that there's like 24 form fields you have to fill out after this. Right? You're not fundamentally changing the experience. Versus if you do something like a button with Apple Pay, then up pops a thing, you just look at it, and you bought it. So very different experience, right? In this case, a multi-step form versus a single double tap with this biometric authentication baked in. That has the potential to drastically simplify purchasing and turn it from like a 30-step process to a one-step process. And so you're much more likely to get contrast there. And so one way to make good use of tests is try these bigger, bolder ideas which have higher risk reward. That's why you test them, because there is a risk there. You want to make sure. And if you operate at very large scale, some people will argue that some of these lower contrast experiences can also show impact. But even there, really look long term, right? Because sometimes the short term stuff will show something, but long term it'll all regress back down to the mean. The other good thing about testing is using it just as hygiene for launching stuff. So when you launch something, put it behind some form of flag, make it a quote unquote test so that you can see what changes. And make sure that there's no unintentional consequences. So basically everything should quote unquote be a little bit of a test in that you put it out and you have the ability to turn it on or off and see what impact it's having on the product. Okay, back to scooter sharing to illustrate another way we make decisions for reasons other than the customers. And so start screen, safety screen, and now we have another form, right, to create an account. And you can see in this form, it's hard to see on here, but see these light gray labels? They're even harder to see down here. I can barely see them, like the first name, last name, email address, which is repeated down below. Enter your first and last names, even though it has the label there. And these things look like this because we have a design guide that says, this is how we do input fields. Input fields, gray text on the line, text below. And in an effort to scale, bless you, the impact of design teams, many companies make these design systems, or they make common design components or front-end components, so that makes it easy for people across the company and beyond to create product designs. But pulling a few off-the-shelf design components from a library is not the same thing as creating a good experience. For example, this is JetRadar. It's a flight search engine. And you may ask, what the heck is going on here? But if you look over here, they're actually using the material design pattern for input fields. They have the little label at the top. They put the text below. The label is light gray and barely hidden, but then it's duplicated in here. But they're using the design pattern. And then this weird arrow green thing is actually the material design floating action button pattern. So they're using design patterns, very consistent. But you don't have to be a UX expert to see this doesn't seem very good, does it? Right? This design for their site, which is what they now have, seems a little clear. I could still nitpick some things on here, right? But seems a lot more straightforward on what they do and how you use it, doesn't it? And so the point is simply applying a style guide or design components doesn't ensure your product design works well. In fact, it can have the opposite effect. Now, in fairness, material design has updated both of these guidelines I showed to kind of cover some cases like this, but the point still stands. There's much more to a holistic user experience than picking up off-the-shelf components and guidelines and stitching them together. And while these design systems have really good aims, they can quickly become a reason for people doing something like for the sake of consistency, right? And just because something is consistent doesn't necessarily mean it's good. So when we saw, hey, everybody else is doing it, the data made me do it, here's another reason, like the guidelines made me do it. And I had to do it this way because that's what it says in our design system. So it gets worse when those decisions are made without this deeper understanding of the problem space, right? And so cumulatively, whether it's design guidelines, whether it's testing results, whether it's competitive analysis or some other rationale, the more product decisions get made for reasons other than the customers, the more the gap between what the thing is and why it's supposed to be there expands. Because people are doing things for reasons other than what the customer needs. And to come back to scooter sharing one last time, if you come to a scooter, right, you can have a pretty clear sense of what it's for. Again, what it is, why it exists, pretty straightforward. The gap between this is pretty minimal. With software, we seem to have a harder time, but we can actually do much better. So for example, this is a real quick iteration on you see a scooter, you want to ride it. How do we get people to that value, to that purpose of this service faster and sooner? Well, what you could do is just point your camera at the scooter, QR code. It recognizes there's a QR code, takes you to a web page. That web page tells you that you can start riding. Here's sort of the rules and terms. It has a native payment solution, so you tap on it once. It uses that biometric look at your face, double click, and you're done. It unlocks. Go ride. It literally looks like this, right? 3 steps. Barely. And by the way, we're using the web to make this happen. I'm not even mentioning the fact that you have to go download the app and install it on your phone and all this stuff. Now, you can quibble about how achievable this design is and how feasible it is, but the point is what it's really trying to do is bridge this gap between seeing that scooter and actually having that great experience, right? And when you compare it to other experiences, again, throw in the whole download the app process in front of this, you can really see the contrast. So how do all these experiences get this way, right? They get this way because we start growing, we start getting further away from spending time with customers and actually observing what their behavior is like. And when there's that gap, then people start doing things for other reasons. Design team does things for design team reasons, right? And that starts to create this hole between what something is and why it exists, which you may say, well, Luke, isn't that just design nerderism? Like, who really cares? This gap between form and function. Like, what are you talking about? Why do we care? You care because it creates this hole between how people can go from not knowing what the hell you are to actually loving you. And let me illustrate that for a second. And that, by the way, actually starts to affect bottom line and growth. So how does this start to affect our bottom line growth? Let's illustrate by looking at an example of e-commerce. And by the way, I ended up on this one because it was on one of the top 10 e-commerce site designs of the year And I believe everything I read on the internet, so I went over here to experience one of the greatest e-commerce site designs. And this was what I was greeted with. I followed that link, and I found two things. One is an app install banner, and the other one is a newsletter promo. Not so design of the year to me yet, but that's okay. So I did what most people do, is I try to remove this thing, and I found that X, and then something happened. Now I got, in addition to the app install banner, I got this sort of promotional banner. There's an icon-based nav, and then there's a feature for maybe the line of clothing that they're trying to push right now on the site. And because I was so effective at removing the thing before, it turned out to be so good, I started removing other things. And when I removed those things, more interesting stuff started to happen. Now I got not only the feature, but these category links about what's inside the site, which doesn't seem that compelling until you consider the impact of this UI. In a few tests, GrowthRock compared these standard e-commerce feature carousel-based UIs, right? You've seen these all. There's like a big carousel up front. And then they counter-tested it against ones that exposed categories at the top, making it kind of clear what's available inside the product. And what they got is a 5% increase in completed orders. And note the metric we're tracking here. It's actually completed orders, kind of the more core metric to what an e-commerce site would care about. And they had some evidence that this actually came from the category pages because simultaneously page views of those category pages jumped something to 10 to 12%. So that was good. Then they ran a similar experiment in another vertical. In this case, for an ice cream retailer, they listed their categories up front. In this case, it was much more dramatic. They got a 29% increase in completed orders. And again, category page views jumped up. Another example comes from Google's mobile optimization efforts. So this is Edgar's. This is a large fashion retailer in South Africa. They had this giant animated banner. They basically removed that and introduced some high-level categories up front on the site. And when they did that, they got a 13% increase in revenue per visitor. So there's something about exposing what's in your product to people that makes them actually find it and buy it. Stunning, I know. But it seems like getting the categories on the site to be more visible is a good idea, especially if we care about things like sales. But there's more that we can do to help people get to the value of this product and close this third gap we're talking about now. So the next thing I'll tackle is, you see this little icon-based navigation thing here, right? While you may think, hey, it's so obvious that that's a search icon, I would contend that maybe not. Right? Amazon learned this the hard way when they rolled out in India recently, because people over there thought it was a ping pong paddle and had no idea what it was or why they would interact with it. So they had to put like a pointer that says, this is how you search the site. So while we think these icons maybe are universal, I would contend they're really not as universal as we believe they are. And so when there's important functions like search, it makes sense to invest in clarifying them a bit. So instead of this icon-based navigation thing here, what we'll do is just pull out search, and it actually gives us an opportunity to talk again about some of the things that are findable, buyable in the site. We can call out some of these popular items like cardigans and bodysuits, which turns out this is what this brand is known for. I did not know that before. But we can reinforce that. And I specifically call out search as critical because, again, we've got a whole bunch of evidence that shows when you go from having search being a hidden function to having search being a very visible function, good things happen, right? And in this case, there's an increase in the number of searches, and we know that conversion rates are higher for people who use search because they actually have intent. They know kind of what they're looking for, and so getting them to what they're looking for sooner is a good thing. You see a similar transition in the Google Photos app. Before, search was a floating action button down here. And in the current designs, it's a header. And again, it has some of these nice hints offering you suggestions on what you can actually do with the app, what kinds of things you can find, what kinds of things you can do. And by the way, this is another example. We're just simply applying a design component without deeper thought can point you astray. So now we've pulled out the search area. We have category links exposed. How else can we get people to the value of this product sooner, faster, easier? Right? How can we close this gap between what it is and why it exists? And hopefully you're starting to see it's not just design nerderism, right? It's like actually meaningful. So I was so happy removing things before. I'm going to do it again. And if I drop that feature image, look what pops up. They have this thing of popular products right there. In fact, it's the products that customers like the most. Now, I would wager that featured image probably doesn't do too much to drive core metrics, just because I've seen so many carousel click-through rates in the past. Right? So maybe that's not that useful. But what is useful is definitely showing some of the things you can get here. In fact, it's so useful I would throw more in there. Why just limit it to 2? And with this, we can kind of position at the side and make it a nice scrollable area. So people with their one hand, one thumb use can just sort of like and just start scrolling through a bunch of products until they find something that they like. Right? This is going to make all of our millennial users super happy because they're scroll machines. Pinterest found that in the onboarding experience for Pinterest, most of the time Pinterest, which is this way to discover images you like, they had a label, they showed how many people liked it, how many people pinned it, who pinned it, all those kinds of things. But for people making their way to Pinterest for the first time, they remove all of that because people have a higher success rate of coming back if they get to see more images because they're more likely to find something they like. And so the same principle applies here. At Pinterest, what they did is they removed all this stuff so you could get more photos on screen. And the core product value they have is finding images you like. Right? So removing that shows more images. But we're going to do a similar thing to show more products and get people to more products so they're more likely to find something that they like. Now, overall, I think we're making progress here, getting people towards this core value. Right? One thing we could do, sort of doesn't look so great to me to have the pictures on the bottom and leading with the category. I don't know. Maybe we could do something like this, cleaning it up a little bit. But if the goal is to get people from this state, what the hell is this? Or even worse, I want to get out of here. Right? What's your reaction when you come on to a screen like that? Certainly isn't a very positive one. But if we want to get people from this mindset to this kind of mindset, to the, oh, I get it, this looks like my kind of thing. Oh, let me dig in here. Feels like we're making some progress, right? Now, some of you may say, but Luke, there was these big free shipping promos. We know that free shipping is very useful. It's true. When you look at the reasons why people abandon checkout, half of people abandon because they were just browsing. But then these are the percentages for people who remain after that. And you can see the number one reason is extra costs were too high, shipping, taxes, whatever. So yeah, something like free shipping, great. That's going to help convince people not to abandon their shopping cart. That's awesome. I'm not against it. But what I contend is there's a much better time and place for it. Perhaps on the product page. I know, madness. Perhaps on the checkout page. And the tricky but valuable thing that makes mobile design hard is finding the right time and place for things. Most of the time, it's not on the home screen with a giant promo pop up the moment you enter. It's usually not the right time for most messages. Sometimes, maybe. But things that are important should be included when and where they're actually important. And I know that's harder to do than just to throw it all on the front screen. Now, we can do this all day, but I'll add just one more consideration to this redesign, which is someone looking at this might say, hey, Luke, but what about the brand? What about the essence? Well, I hope that comes through with the actual products and the fonts and the imagery and the colors and those sorts of things. When people say that, what they're basically saying is, we want something like this. We want some aspirational imagery that reflects the personality of the company. It gets people to hook in. They, for example, here, it's this edgy Mad Max desert something look. Right, so how do we bring that? And I agree, maybe there's an opportunity to do something like that, which is why I flipped the two things earlier. But maybe we could, oh, oops, I think I skipped a slide on accident. Unskip. Play. So maybe what we could do is bring in some kind of brand thing, if you want, I guess. Still have the categories, still have the popular products. I'd argue we still have a lot of the functional benefits, right, that we've been adding by adding and removing things. But just be careful that when you start to do stuff like that, that you're not doing it for all these other reasons. That is actually something for the customer as opposed to the brand team who's pushing on that. Because otherwise you're going to end up back at a product experience that just mashes up the agenda of all these teams together. So I focused a lot on this poor Free People site. I'm sorry, but it's not like they're the only e-commerce site that has these kinds of experiences. Right? Looking at a bunch of other sites, they are all doing similar things. And maybe it's because business teams are doing things because of competitive audits. Maybe it's product managers doing things because of A/B tests, so on and so forth. But the cumulative effect is that we create this gap between people's first impressions and actually understanding what you're there for. So when there's this big difference between what it is and why it exists, we insert all this stuff that isn't part of the core value. Then it makes it really hard for people to get from first-time experience to awesome experience. And when that happens, it gets to the point where it really starts to affect bottom line and growth for companies. We're not helping people transition to becoming happy customers, to repeat customers, to loyal customers, to enthusiastic customers. We're cutting them off at the very beginning before they even have a chance to make it to step one. And it's not just the presence of things like app install banners and mistimed promotions and all these things that keep people from getting the product value. It's the impressions and in many cases the mental model that they create when they go through a first-time user experience. To illustrate this, I want to walk through a few iterations we went for this app called Spaces that Google launched a while ago. And we originally had this little simple splash screen like you saw on some of the other services. Not much happening here, but we immediately realized we had a problem because we started using this metric called TTTP, which was time to toilet paper. Because people would open this up and they'd be like, why is that toilet paper there? I don't get it. Why do you have toilet paper on this thing? So then we tried multiple examples of how you could use this product as opposed to a bunch of random stuff. Because we saw the random stuff was distracting and setting people up for not knowing what's going on. And we would show examples like, hey, you can use this for cake recipes or cycling groups, because it's like a small group conversational thing. And when we did this, people would be like, well, I don't cook. I already have a place for family photos. And the first thing that they saw had this really disproportionate impact on how they thought about it. They immediately set an understanding in their head of what it was for and whether or not it was for them. It happened very, very fast, as you saw with the toilet paper and with these examples. But at this point, our user experience researcher, Max, noticed something very interesting. When we were testing this product with different people, we were constantly asking them to describe what they thought it was for. And he found, bless you, by looking at these comments, that there was two different mental models that people had of the product. Some people thought of it with a private mental model. That is, they said, oh, I would use this for things like school team projects, or I'd use this for my small private group about this. And then he saw other people who would say, oh, it's kind of like a public, Pinteresty, bloggy type of thing where you post stuff. So there was these two different models. One people thought it was for private use cases. One group of people thought it was for public use cases. And we could kind of measure how many had each different mental model. Now, depending on what they saw first, they entered into one of these modes. And while that was interesting, what was much more interesting was when he sliced the people with these different mental models based on how they rated the app after a week of use. And they rated it around dimensions like, is it easy to use, is it fun, and most importantly, is it useful? And you can see the people who thought it was for private stuff universally thought it was more useful, thought it was had better visual appeal, thought it was easier to use. So there's a big difference there. And so our reaction was, okay, well then we need to make it much clearer to people that there's both of these use cases, right? And so we created these intro screens that are like, hey, there's public spaces and private spaces, right? But that didn't help much. So then we tried to explain how the two are related. We say, oh, you can take stuff that you find in these public spaces and put them in your private spaces. Get it? That's how they work together. Well, that didn't help much either. So then we dropped all mentions of public spaces altogether. We never even mentioned it in the onboarding. But then when somebody went in to create one of these spaces, right, they'd hit create a space, there'd be a choice that says, you want to make it private or public? So we just sort of delayed that confusion till later. So then we said, okay, well, what if we, instead of doing this, what if we like hide the private option under an edit link, and then, or hide the public option under an edit link and disguise it from people that way? That started to help a little bit. And then we kept tweaking this, and more throughout the experience, we kept telling people, this is private. Hey, what you've got here is private. Blah, 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 blah. And the more and more we started to talk about that and make it front and center in the app, the more we were able to move people to this private mental model. Now, we only ever got it to like 60% of people had a private mental model because we never really killed the whole public feature, which is what we should have done ultimately. But through all these efforts, we were actually able to make a lot of progress here. And if you remember, the people that had this private mental model thought it was useful, thought it was fun, thought it was easier to use. So by changing what people see when and how, we were actually able to create more of a perception of value, more of an understanding of the purpose of the application. But again, we should have just killed the feature. What do you take away from this? What you should take away from this is that people get in their heads an understanding of what your service and product is for really early on. And once these things get set, they are really hard to change. And even small things can trigger this. So getting these mental models right is really important, making sure people run into the right content, removing things that get in the way of the right content, and embracing the fact that most people sort of learn by poking around and bringing things to them while they're in the process of doing that. And now that you see this laid out this way, you can go back and reflect on what we were doing with the Free People redesign, right? And that's really a lot of the same work that we were doing. Getting rid of the things that were in the way of people understanding the core value and purpose of that site. Okay, we've talked about a lot of stuff. Let me try to summarize things concisely here. When companies grow, this gap between the customer and the company starts to emerge, which means people start doing things for reasons other than the customer. That starts to create this gap between what a product is and why it exists, which makes it harder for people to get to product value. And ultimately, that affects the bottom line. Not great, right? So what can we do to close these gaps? Right? How do we bridge these holes? We talked about 3 of these sorts of issues, and we'll talk about 3 ways to close them. So the first thing we can do is just be mindful that these exist and what makes them grow. Right? When the voice of the customer is missing in conversations, bring it back. When requirements are conflicting with like a holistic product experience, push back on them. And when the most important experiences, the big picture experiences like sales on an e-commerce site are lagging, work on why. And really take that big picture, customer-centric perspective to things. Because knowing is half the battle. No? Okay. I really like that picture, but that's just me. All right. Next, metrics. I have this fundamental belief that you are what you measure. And so spending the time to get the right metrics in place affects so much stuff downstream, makes your life so much easier. Imagine that you set a metric in your company to increase the number of native app downloads. And you track it, and the CEO's looking at it, all this stuff, right? So you might start out with, okay, well, let's add a button to let people get that app. Okay, well, that converted like 0.02%. What if we put it in the middle of the content and make it a bit bigger and add a value prop, right? Reddit mobile app, faster, better, stronger, open it. Ooh, that's doing better. Okay, so if we put it in the content, more people will get the native app than when we just put it above the content. What if we now try putting it on the content? Okay, that's working pretty good. So how about we make it bigger? Okay, go bigger. All right, okay, and what if we A/B test the copy? Okay, the best copy, keep browsing. I'm sorry, I'm a loser. Get the app now, I'm the best. Okay, that works good. So let's do that. Oh, I have a new hypothesis. What if instead of just putting things over the content and in between the content and above the content, we just like overlay the entire content with it? Oh, that's performing even better. And you have effectively at this point become what you measure. You are a giant app install ad. Congratulations. So, very important to spend the time figuring out what metrics to measure and why. And how to decide what to measure, I won't walk through this, but you can get the slides later and look through it. The most important thing I would contend here is think long-term and think user-centric when you think about metrics. Transactional, short-term metrics can really quickly get you into a position like the Reddit app. And finally, and most importantly, the third way to start closing these gaps is pretty simply just spend time with the people who use your stuff. As much time as you can. And I want to come back to that Airbnb story that I started this talk off with. So Airbnb, while it launched, and Nathan with Joe and Brian built a new website, they weren't growing. It was just flat for a very long period of time. And so Paul Graham in 2009, who was an investor in Airbnb, told Joe and Brian to go to New York and hang out with the people that were using their service. There's a couple people who had listed stuff in New York. And so they went out there. They actually stayed with 24 different hosts. And what they realized across the board is the listings that people had when they were in them, they were beautiful. They were amazing apartments. They looked great. But the photos online made them look like dingy dumps. They really didn't capture the things that they were renting. So like, hey, we can fix this problem. They went and rented a $5,000 camera and they went around and took pictures of all the hosts that had listed their places in New York and put them on Airbnb. And when they did that, the revenue in New York the next week doubled. Right? And then they started up doing that in other markets, and the same thing happened. And I like this quote from Joe because he's basically saying, like, when we went and stayed with our customers, that's when we learned what we needed to do. And based on the success of this photography program, which was them taking the pictures originally, then they kicked off a scaled service where they would hire photographers in different regions to go and take pictures, and you can sort of see what happened to their growth after that. To again come back to a quote from Joe, we were able to listen to their needs, design a product they love. And he attributes all of that success to being as close as possible to the people using their service, which is really the exact same experience he had at RISD with design critiques and crit buns. Getting as close as you can to the problem helps inform how to solve for it. And it's not just these little upstart companies that can do this stuff, although Airbnb is big now. When I was at eBay in 2004, we had this eBay Visits program. We would go to eBay sellers' homes. And these programs exist in our companies. We just get caught up in what we're doing organizationally, and we get caught up in our workload, and we don't make time. Oh, I have to go to a meeting. I got to write this email. I can't go see what a customer is actually doing. I'm too busy. But there's other ways to bring user voice into your organization. When I was in my earlier teams at Google, we organized this talk every week, every Friday for an hour called What Did We Learn This Week? And it quickly became everybody's favorite meeting. You can see they're so happy and excited to be there. But what we did is we brought either researchers or quant analysts or anybody that had talked to customers and watched people use our products to tell us what they learned. And we'd spend an hour hearing about it from different products. We had about 10 different products in the group. And we would learn a ton, and then we'd go on and repeat the process. So it doesn't have to be a big hard thing, right? The bottom line is there's really no substitute for spending time with customers. Do it regularly, do it often. If the word user research or usability or anything like that scares you, don't call it that. Call it spending time with customers. That doesn't sound so scary, right? And getting people that info of what you observe is really the best way to start fixing and closing these gaps. Because only through this kind of direct empathy, through really seeing the world through our customers' eyes, that we can make good on this planet scale opportunity, right? There's 4 billion networked pocket-sized supercomputers online able to access the experiences that we make for them right now, and that number is growing. But let's make it the kind of experiences we want them to have, the kind of experiences we would want our friends and family to have, not the kind of experiences we all dislike having, but allow our companies to ship. And the seams that we talked about can open up really quickly, right? These gaps can start to form very, very fast. So we really need to be vigilant and make sure that we're conscious of these things happening. We can put in processes that prevent us from going off the rails with things like well thought out metrics. But of all these relatively, I would say, basic concepts, the most important one is still spending time with customers, right? And using these basic gaps or these basic principles to close these gaps, we can make a better web for everybody and still have successful businesses, as I've hopefully illustrated. Right? All the examples I tried to show are ways to have positive impact on the stuff companies care about for their growth and their success. They're not counter to having a good product experience. In fact, the two things should go hand in hand. Because customers that love your company will what? Spend money with your company. Tell everybody about your company. Right? These two things are good together. They're not in conflict. And please help me do this, because I would really like to have the web be awesome and not crappy. If not for my sake, then for your own sake, do it for your children's sake. All right, that's all I got for you. Thank you very much.